From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. November 16, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. More on Ventura winning governor election. Media reaction, tons more. By Observer staff. There has never been a period in American wrestling history where pro wrestling has been the subject of so much mainstream media attention. Between the shocking victory of Jesse Ventura in the race for governor of Minnesota, which resulted in front-page coverage in newspapers around the country, and the attention pro wrestling itself is receiving due to the mainstream media discovering its popularity boom, it is virtually impossible to escape almost a total bombardment of pro wrestling articles the likes of which have never been seen before. The election of Ventura, a third-party candidate from the Ross Perot-formed Reform Party, who had been running third, and up until the final week, a distant third, in the polls, came out on a national basis as the biggest individual election story, almost as much because of a third-party political outsider beating the establishment as because of the novelty of Ventura as a former pro wrestler. Most newspapers gave significant coverage to Ventura on November 5, many printing the New York Times front-page story or localized versions of the same. The demand for Ventura skyrocketed, all the way to his appearing over the weekend on Meet the Press, where his comments on Bill and Hillary Clinton, in response to Hillary calling his campaign a sideshow and his responding that I think that she maybe ought to not leave the White House as often as she used to. Bad things seem to happen when she leaves, springboarded yet another round of front-page coverage nationally for Ventura on November 9th. During the show he challenged host Tim Russert to take off his shirt and show off his chest, a challenge Russert didn't take. But clearly clever methods to get as much media stretch out of his time in the sun as well. CNN did a 1-hour feature on his life over the weekend, and newspapers across the country and actually around the world were preparing major features on this improbable election result that nobody saw coming. His election inspired the Today Show to interview Vince McMahon on November 5th about Ventura, a subject he didn't seem all that pleased to discuss, probably because Ventura won a much-publicized $1 million plus verdict over McMahon in a lawsuit several years ago, although sensing the media tide. Both McMahon and Jim Ross changed their tune from days earlier by the time Monday night came around as everyone in wrestling tried to jump on the bandwagon. None more pathetically, however, than Hulk Hogan. At the same time, mainstream magazines appear to be clamoring for pro wrestling stories. On the heels of the recent New York Magazine cover story, this past week Spin magazine released a story on the pro wrestling promotional war in ESPN magazine in the November 16th issue with John Elway on the cover had an 8-page story on EMLL wrestling at Arena Mexico, ironically with no tie-in to the U.S. wrestling scene, based around the September 18th and September 25th shows. The Current People magazine, covering the sexiest men in the country, had a photo of Bill Goldberg on a page of sexiest bald men with the likes of Michael Jordan. Steve Austin had been photographed for that spot, although the magazine went with Goldberg, possibly because they were already going to proclaim Austin as one of the breakout entertainment stars of 1998 and the magazine had planned features on both men to come out over the next few weeks. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Newsweek is planning a major story on Austin which will be released on November 16th with talk, depending upon the news of the week, that it could even be a cover story. Southwest Airlines magazine is planning a cover story on Vince McMahon that will be released in January. Rolling Stone has an Austin feature imminent and has shot him for the cover, although it's not a lock he'll be on the cover. Cigar Aficionado is working on a feature on Hulk Hogan. Forbes, Maxim, Time, Playboy and even Pro Football Weekly are all currently working on pro wrestling articles. Many, like the November 9th front page story in the San Jose Mercury, spawned probably more by Ventura's election than the Monday night ratings, will wind up being puff pieces the likes of which appeared during the 80s boom, with exaggerated figures, such as listing pro wrestling now as a $2 billion per year industry grossing $650 in merchandising, $300 million in pay-per-view and selling out 400 to 500 major arena shows per year. While we don't have accurate merchandising figures, $650 is ridiculously high. Total arena merchandising between WWF and WCW will probably slightly top $30 million. Pay-per-view this year, all revenue derived as opposed to revenue the wrestling companies actually see, about 43% of the total gross, will top $200 million. Between WWF and WCW, they'll each do about 180 house shows and probably sell out close to half. Others will examine things more closely. The irony that the raunchier and more adult-oriented themes the WWF's Raw show revolves around, the higher the percentage, which has grown to 37% in recent weeks, of the viewers are kids. The Philadelphia Inquirer featured a front-page story on November. Companies actually see about 43% of the total gross will top $200 million. Between WWF and WCW, they'll each do about 180 house shows and probably sell out close to half. Others will examine things more closely. The irony that the raunchier and more adult-oriented themes the WWF's Raw show revolves around, the higher the percentage, which has grown to 37% in recent weeks, of the viewers are kids. The Philadelphia Inquirer featured a front-page story on November 9th, and the Los Angeles Times and Dallas Morning News, among others, are expected to run huge features over the next week. If there is one healthy theme to this round of media attention, is that it's the first round in history where real versus fake is no longer being examined as an issue, and the recent NBC special hasn't been even acknowledged in most of the press coverage. This mainstream attention is also leading to more wrestling product on national cable television. Due to the NBA strike, TNT as of November 10th has added another hour of wrestling in primetime on Tuesdays at 8 p.m., a taped fourth hour from the previous night's taping that will be called Nitro Extra, testing the waters of both overexposure of the product and the patience of its Monday Night Live audience to sit through and stay hot for a house show that will last 4.5 hours. TNT, which ordered WCW to do the show as a replacement for its franchise NBA broadcasts, is committed to the show as a test for at least 3 weeks, and probably longer until the NBA work stoppage is settled. Fox Sports is looking at its own pro wrestling project, possibly even starting its own company from scratch, which, given the talent situation right now, would be an idea that is unlikely to pay dividends unless they are willing to lose mountains of money for many years, but would be financial death in the short run. The Nashville network is planning to start its own one-hour Friday night wrestling show at 8 p.m. as a lead-in for its attempt to establish Roller Jam, a 90s version of the old Roller Derby, as a Friday night franchise, the latter of which debuts in January, with former AWF promoter Paul Alperstein among those in the running for the time slot. The Learning Channel's pro wrestling documentary is scheduled for November 15th. The NBC much-panned Secrets of Pro Wrestling will air once again on November 21st in prime time. The Bret Hart movie will air over the next week throughout Canada and on December 20th on A&E in the United States. And there are several other movie projects in the works, including a new one on the Von Erich family. But all this pales next to Ventura's election as governor. Ventura became the poster child for a citizenry tired of politics as usual and typical politicians bickering along party lines, proclaiming himself an independent without political ties, and being in the right place with his tremendous delivery, learned from his days as a sardonic pro wrestling heel, spelled a huge upset win. While his election was treated as something of a joke nationally, it was considered a very serious candidate in Minnesota, but one who somewhat got a free pass from both the local media, which considered it beneath their dignity to go after for running without a platform, and his two opponents, who considered him more as a potential spoiler than someone with a chance of winning and didn't want to alienate his constituency. They figured at the last minute might vote for them in a close race. He gained points with voters also by answering questions that he didn't think he knew the answers to, with "I don't know," instead of political double talk. With the Reform Party, due to Perot's results in the last election, qualifying for $16 million in federal funds for the 2000 election, Ventura's win in a major election made him by far the most likely candidate that party would send into the next presidential election. However, on Meet the Press, Ventura stopped that speculation dead in its tracks, saying he was going to serve his 4-year term, but also said the party needed someone other than Perot to run. Only a little has been written about Ventura having to govern a state in which there is no member of his political party in either house or ties to people with political experience to appoint to his administration. Hogan had been something of a Ventura rival dating back to Hogan's arrival in the AWA in 1981, taking Jesse's spot as the superstar Graham-like charismatic muscle man, and their feud over who had the best physique grew to become legitimate, and the two later had many personal issues to where they genuinely hated one another. The pro wrestling feud didn't result in as many singles matches as it naturally should have, since Ventura wasn't much of a worker and the AWA was usually working in tag teams where, as you may have read somewhere, his best maneuver was inciting the crowd on the apron while the late Adrian Adonis, an incredibly gifted worker at the time, bumped like crazy in the ring, and in the WWF. Before it could get off the ground, Ventura was taken ill. Ventura was fond of saying all week that Hogan, who along with McMahon were besieged with media requests for quotes, had always been a jealous Ventura wannabe. Until this past Tuesday, nothing could be farther from the truth. Since Tuesday, nothing could be more on the mark, something Ventura has apparently taken great delight in based on a lot of his comments of the past week knocking Hogan, who he would berate unmercifully on his talk show, while Hogan, now for the first time ever in the subservient position, was sucking up to him in every venue possible. It was the pro wrestling industry, where the real-life Jim Janos, both the Minneapolis Star-Tribune and USA Today reported his real name incorrectly as James Soros, although in this case fantasy has crossed over into real life in a way that nobody could have ever imagined, earned his main living for nearly 2 decades. Inside that world, the response publicly has been largely supportive. Behind the scenes it appears to be more shocked, amused and bemused. Ventura, who took the name from the California beach city as his original gimmick was a muscleman surfer from San Diego, which he claimed as his hometown throughout his wrestling career, was a genuine star as a pro wrestler, based primarily on his interviews and secondarily on his physique. He was a late 70s Graham knockoff, something Ventura doesn't hide from, as he credited the night he went to the Minneapolis Auditorium right out of the Navy and saw Graham live as the day that changed his life. The irony is that was similar to a situation a few years later when Terry Bollea saw Graham wrestle every Tuesday night when he was working the Florida circuit at the Fort Homer Hesterly Armory in Tampa. Ventura and Graham later became good friends. He and Adonis, one of the very best workers of that period, were a very successful tag team called the East-West Connection, particularly in the AWA, where they held the tag team titles for 11 months in 1980-81, and the two also had a stint in the WWF. Ventura was among the first to jump from the AWA to the WWF in the Wrestling War of 1984, doing so in memorable fashion. Ventura, at the time forming a tag team with another exceptionally talented worker, Japan's Masa Saito, as in a spoof of his former team name called the Far East-West Connection, came to the studio one day and cut promos for local house show inserts for about the next month. After cutting the interviews, the very next day came a telegram from him to the AWA telling them he was gone to the WWF as of that moment, with no notice given during a period where pro wrestling was so primitive that the wrestlers didn't have anything resembling contracts. This didn't stop the AWA from continuing to run the promos for the next month and advertise him for shows they knew he wasn't going to appear on. Unfortunately, health problems from a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in his lung, which he later tried to get into a class action suit about, claiming it was due to Agent Orange from his military days in Vietnam, knocked him out of the ring a day or two before a Madison Square Garden show that he was scheduled to headline opposite WWF champion Hulk Hogan to begin his first major run with the company. In 1982, Ventura had a run in the WWF, including some matches against then-champ Bob Backlund that were only so-so at the box office based on the standards of the time. While recovering, Vince McMahon put him on the air on the company's B show as a color commentator, replacing the inept Angelo Mosca. He was such a success he was quickly moved to the A show, where he began his most famous run in the profession, as the third man in the broadcast booth alongside himself through his taunts of McMahon and silent broadcast partner Bruno Sammartino, and it was there where Ventura really made his mark during the first WWF heyday. While Ventura wasn't the first heel color commentator, he was the first with that type of national exposure, and his popularity, largely stealing the Howard Cosell catchphrase of "I tell it like it is," led to the heel color commentator being a staple on wrestling broadcasts, to where it remains to this day, with the likes of Bobby Heenan and Jerry Lawler every Monday night. Ventura actually tried to make a comeback in the ring in 1985 and 1986. The strange thing was, although a heel, he was wildly cheered in his few appearances in his attempted comeback because of his announcing role getting over. But physically, Ventura, whose first major ring break came as a masked heel with long bleached blonde hair coming out of the back of his mask called the Great Ventura, and later unmasked as Jesse Ventura in Oregon, feuding with the likes of Moondog Mayne, Jimmy Snuka and Dutch Savage, who had 2 reigns as singles champ and 5 as tag champ from 1976 to 1978, was never much of a worker in the ring, but even impromptu from his early days in St. Louis and Kansas City preceding Oregon was a natural on the mic. Afterwards, as his announcing was getting him over, he recognized his future wasn't inside the ring. He crossed over first with roles in some Arnold Schwarzenegger moves, most notably Predator in 1986, a role which wasn't arranged by the WWF, which nearly led to him losing his job in the control-oriented WWF. After completion of the movie, he announced his retirement as an active wrestler. He remained with the WWF as an announcer through 1990, when after a dispute with McMahon over him signing a personal video game deal not brokered through the WWF, which McMahon felt was in competition with a WWF company video game, he was fired when he refused to back down again. He took his wrestling shtick into real sports as a color commentator for stings on the radio broadcasts of the NFL's Tampa Bay Buccaneers and later the Minnesota Vikings, both runs being short-lived, and as a spoof of his wrestling commentary role in a short-lived syndicated game show which saw contestants spray each other with glop, throw pies at each other and pound on each other with oversized boxing gloves. He served 1 term as mayor of Brooklyn Park from 1991 through 1995, a part-time position while signing a 3-year $350,000 per year deal as a color commentator for WCW in January 1992, a period which left bitter feelings on both sides to the point he was paid and not even used for the last 6 months of his contract. Most recently, he had a successful stint as a midday talk show host on KFAN radio in the Twin Cities. His political victory was attributed in local newspapers as being his success with young voters, the kind who grew up watching him on Vern Gagne's wrestling show where he gave Gene Okerlund the name Mean Gene and would routinely call he and Adonis regular tag team foes, Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell, known as the High Flyers, as the High Criers. It was not unlike Antonio Inoki's successful run for the Japanese Senate, although Ventura was nowhere near the mainstream star in wrestling that Inoki or Korean counterpart Senator Kentaro Oki were in their cultures. He drew equally from Republican and Democrats, and won because of a nearly amazing 63% voter turnout, a healthy percentage being under 35 voters who had never voted before. Editorial writer DJ Tyson, the St. Paul Pioneer Press, wrote before the results were in, noted that Ventura wasn't harmed in the least by his statements of subjects which he was misinformed, noting Ventura's repeated statements about Abraham Lincoln being a third-party candidate, which he wasn't, and also a former pro wrestler, which he most definitely wasn't, but were repeated in the media as fact for the rest of the week. But his wit made him cooler than the drab typical politicians he was facing, and his wrestling background made them the decided underdogs that nobody actually recognized going into the debates that spawned his popularity uprising. In fact, Humphrey, the frontrunner, insisted on Ventura being included in the debates, feeling he would draw more votes from Republican Norm Coleman. He could pander to both public education and the gun lobby with impunity, being an outsider with no platform or real political history to be judged on, something his well-entrenched foes couldn't do. Tice's conclusion was that Ventura was the candidate not of the uninformed, as some of the national media has tried to proclaim, but of the half-informed, a people who know it all, but about half of it is wrong. Ventura's victory received huge mainstream press in Japan as well, and like most of America, it was treated as a joke. But not as much because of Ventura's wrestling background, which is where the comedy came in this country. In Japan, where the idea of a pro wrestler being elected to office was hardly a foreign concept, citizens of Minnesota were mocked for electing into office someone who talked about legalizing marijuana for medicinal purposes and prostitution. There was a lot made of a 1982 match where Ventura, who for obvious reasons never made any kind of a name in Japan, headlined against Inoki, because it pitted a future governor in one country against a future senator from another. It was a big match at the time, and as you can imagine, it was a big-time stinker. Perhaps the biggest affirmation of the popularity of pro wrestling's significance in pop culture was that a man was elected governor who was a former local mayor, a former NFL radio announcer, a former movie actor, a former game show host, and a current radio talk show host, was still known primarily as a former pro wrestler, a job he hadn't held for more than 12 years. Coming from playing bad guy in a conman profession to the governorship of a real state is startling in theory, but not in reality. Why is playing pro wrestler, and being a good communicator, any worse than the background of other athletes and entertainers that have won political office, from Ronald Reagan, the Californians elected governor, and after being considered largely unsuccessful in that role, the country elected him president twice, down the lines to sports stars like Jack Kemp, Jim Bunning, Bill Bradley and Steve Largent, and singers like the late Sonny Bono or actors like Clint Eastwood, some of whom became highly respected political leaders. There is a difference, as all of the above ran as politicians, while Ventura ran as the anti-politician, dressing down as opposed to wearing suits and ties while campaigning, appearing to shoot from the hip. For one thing, Ventura, who is attempting to change his name to Jesse the Mind Ventura, although he said he was giving up the body moniker first in 1986 because he considered it presumptuous playing alongside Schwarzenegger in the movies, and 12 years later he's still known by that name, was never the typical wrestler. He always had designs of using pro wrestling to springboard him mainstream, as even in his early wrestling fame he was looking to get into acting. People laughed, but he made it. He tried to get into sports broadcasting, which was considered a joke at the time for people within pro wrestling, but he made it. He ran for mayor, which was considered a big joke, and he won by a landslide against a multi-term incumbent. As mayor, he was also considered something of a joke with his own city council that he constantly was at odds with, and although he got a lot of publicity for the city, he lost far more battles in that position than he won and decided against running for re-election, and as his term was winding down, bitterly proclaimed politics to be a far dirtier business than pro wrestling. He sued Vince McMahon in a case that went years that people said he had no chance to win and spent 6 figures not giving up the fight, and wound up whipping him in court. He was one of the first people to hire an agent to represent him, both in contract negotiations with McMahon, unheard of at the time, and in arranging deals outside pro wrestling. His victory over McMahon in court largely due to testimony from his agent Barry Bloom about being lied to by then Titan VP Dick Glover in contract negotiations, which apparently invalidated the fact Ventura had signed away in his contract the very money rights he was going after in court. This victory was among the things that made Bloom the #1 agent in the pro wrestling world, a position he maintains today. And finally, he ran for governor, taking out a $300,000 loan to finance his campaign, and not spending a dime on commercials until the final weeks, doing unique commercials that no other candidate in the nation would dare do, featuring his 80s WWF toy action figures, a half-naked Ventura in a pose portraying Rodin's The Thinker, and another radio spot with a jingle based on the theme from Shaft. Can you dig it? The commercials and the results have put the man who designed them, Bill Hillsman of Minneapolis, who also created an unconventional campaign that elected Paul Wellstone to the U.S. Senate, on the map as a big-time player in that scene. As a third-party novelty, he whipped 2 established state political forces, including the son, we incorrectly last week reported grandson, of political icon Hubert Humphrey, noting that all those wasted votes, as some locally had said a vote for Ventura would be, ended up wasting his opponents. The Jesse Ventura, who was a wrestler and wrestling personality, wound up largely hated by management at the end everywhere he went, although few would dare say so publicly today. He was one of the few who lived to not only tell about it, but laugh about it. He walked out on Gagne with no notice, and later filed suit against him. He didn't back down to McMahon even when threatened with and eventually getting fired at the peak of his popularity, and later whipped him in court. He was given a great deal to join WCW by Kip Frey and Frey's first big move when he took over the company from Jim Herd. But Frey's reign with WCW only lasted a few months before he was replaced by Bill Watts. The Watts/Ventura marriage had no chance of success. The two had conflicting viewpoints on virtually every subject and altogether different philosophies on pro wrestling, and egos the likes of which wouldn't allow them to entertain an opposite viewpoint. Ventura's supporters claimed that Watts wouldn't let Jesse be Jesse. Most insiders saw it as Jesse going in totally unprepared, and his once great announcing had become an embarrassment, although the casual fans never saw through his great delivery and loved him just the same. Those who worked with him said his biggest problem was he believed he, and not pro wrestling, was the show, and he believed what some of the wrestlers told him to kiss his ass, that is, being there made WCW a major league company. Despite his popularity, the addition of Ventura meant nothing to WCW's ratings, although Ventura was quick to point out that the ratings dropped when he was removed for Heenan on WCW Saturday Night, at the time the WCW flagship show, which was the seasonal pattern drop that took place every year. At the time the weather got better and actually had nothing to do with the announcing team, and the ratings went right back up during the next seasonal pattern. By the time Eric Bischoff was running the company, Heenan had blown past Ventura as the lead color guy and taken his spot on pay-per-view shows. Ventura took his demotion as one would expect, visibly pouting on the air and acting totally disinterested in the product during live broadcasts. Bischoff was content to send him home and pay him for the duration of his contract without even using him. The subject of Ventura and steroids has already come up a few times this past week in the New York Post. As a bodybuilding type and Graham wannabe, Ventura developed an impressive physique, although his gimmick as the big blonde superstar Graham of his era was blown when the much larger Hogan came around, partially through use of steroids in the 70s and early 80s. He was among the first pro wrestlers to publicly admit to using steroids while he was still an active star and long before it was any kind of a national issue. By the mid-80s he was doing PSAs and had posters in local gyms in the Twin Cities warning kids that steroids were bad news long before that was fashionable as well. He was vocal in being supportive of Frey's planned steroid policy in WCW, which never really got off the ground since Watts was from a different mindset, which was interesting since he largely has had generally libertarian views when it comes to personal use of drugs. Still, in his November 8th column, Phil Mushnick asked if it wasn't for steroids, would Ventura have ever landed a starring role as a wrestler, and without that, would he have ever springboarded that fame into mainstream in his latest conquest? Mushnick tied Ventura's success in with that of his former acting buddy Schwarzenegger, asking if it wasn't for steroids, Schwarzenegger never would have won those bodybuilding contests that springboarded him to his movie career. Mushnick noted the all-important question springing from the answer to those questions: how can you possibly warn a kid away from steroids? They didn't hurt Arnold or Jesse in getting to where they were going. And they very likely helped. And in a big way. In reality, it's hardly fair to single those two out, as any list of that type would be long, probably longer than anyone could ever imagine, but the question itself is an important one to examine. Except any careful examination would not bring very tidy answers. Within wrestling after the election, while many publicly wanted to jump on the bandwagon to get the media stretch, most notably Hogan, behind the scenes it was considered the ultimate con job, remembering that those in wrestling, particularly from the old school, believe everything in life to be some form of a work. Many in wrestling, including those who worked with him the longest, never even believed Ventura was a Navy SEAL, as he's proclaimed consistently for probably 20+ years. He was definitely in the Navy, and when the question of his proclaimed military service in the SEALs, which he claims to have been in Korea, Hong Kong and the Philippines, and at other times in Vietnam, and having done 134 successful parachute jumps, came up early in the campaign, all Ventura ever produced was a 1973 dated notice that he was in fact discharged from the Navy, claiming to have been in a secret division, and thus there are no records. But on Monday night, with Ventura on the current day's front page of the New York Daily News, and part of the reason the WCW Nitro locker room was filled with major media, you had Hogan dressing like Ventura, pandering to his supposed friend while trying, and successfully getting, a lot of media play with his running for president gimmick. This is the same WCW that a few months back at the Target Center wanted to kick Ventura and his camera crew out of the building at a live Nitro for campaigning at their event. And you had McMahon inviting him on Raw the next week live, and Jim Ross congratulating the Minnesota voters for their guts, just days removed from a Today Show appearance and hotline reports that indicated something different. Among those who worked with him over the years in the wrestling profession, Ventura is seen as a very talented individual with a gift of gab, whose ego was totally out of control in his later years in the business and who relied on delivery and wit to hide what he lacked in preparation and actual knowledge, a view consistent with some who listened to his talk show. In my own very limited dealings with him over the years, he was a charming guy and had a lot more balls than virtually anyone in the profession, and didn't back down to pressure and cared little about who he offended along the way, which made him an interesting subject. He didn't even bother to kiss ass even when he was trying to charm. After his firing by Titan in 1990, he was told by Gene Okerlund that he could probably get his lucrative announcing job back if he attended a surprise birthday party McMahon was throwing for himself in 1991. He wasn't opposed to working for Titan again, even as he was suing McMahon, but saw it as McMahon being wrong in letting him go over the video game dispute, and that he wouldn't go back unless McMahon came to him. Okerlund couldn't believe Ventura wouldn't attend and continually tried to talk him into coming. He was never afraid to offer his straight and direct opinion, but didn't like his opinion being questioned or debated. Even by the standards of successful wrestlers, he had an ego that matched up to what his detractors privately today complain about. While he took pride in his insight to see through cons, unfortunately, like many in wrestling who live so long in the con world, he saw cons even when the subject wasn't a con. His inability to take criticism as an announcer is a trait he's going to need to overcome in the position he's in. People do grow, learn, change, and adapt. But his shooting from the hip, offering opinions and colorful quotes on subjects he knows nothing about, may land him in trouble once the media's initial love affair with him runs out and he actually has to run a state and is treated the way all politicians on that level are. At that point, whether his ability to take criticism has changed, he may wind up being an even more newsworthy candidate than anyone realizes going in. Spin magazine in the current issue has a piece on the wrestling war entitled, "The Steel Cage, No Holds Barred, Cable Ratings Deathmatch," by Mark Shine, and is one of the better pieces on the subject to date. There were a few minor problems, but it was overall far better research than most and certainly didn't have a puff piece perspective. The story gave some background scene to attending both a WWF house show in Albany and a WCW Nitro in Cedar Rapids, focusing on Austin and Goldberg as each group's top star. It talked of McMahon buying his father's company and bringing it to a golden era that peaked with the Pontiac Silverdome WrestleMania in 1987 and fell in 1992 due to various scandals. It claimed ratings in the down period fell to a 2 share, when they never got close to that low, although they did fall below a 2 rating for the flagship shows. It noted ECW's place in the revival of wrestling, claiming ECW during its mid-90s heyday nourished pro wrestling with fresh storylines and a higher flying style. From a business standpoint, ECW, riding the wave of pro wrestling popularity, is far larger and more successful than it was, even if the quality of the wrestling by and large, at least as the top level, can't compare to the days when it had Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, or Rey Mysterio Jr. appearing. It portrayed Eric Bischoff as hiring Hogan and all the WWF's top stars, many, but not all, including their announcing team. He did hire both Heenan and Gene Okerlund, and you could make a stretch and put Tony Schiavone in that category as well, and many of ECW's top stars as well. The story noted there was a limit in how edgy Bischoff would take WCW, because he was looking to attract a new generation of advertisers that would see pro wrestling as something other than bargain basement level entertainment despite its ratings, noting WCW wouldn't even allow one of its wrestlers, Lodi, to use the ring name Skank. Jerry Solomon, an exec with SFM Media, noted, It's just a case of the ratings getting high enough that people can rationalize what they're buying, and Shaheen noted that the people who purchase the ad time are aware 10 million people are watching on Monday nights but haven't actually seen the shows themselves, and don't know that there is a difference between the two products. Not noted in the story is one of pro wrestling's dirty little secrets regarding advertising, which is that buying WWF's Sunday Night Heat and WCW's Thunder are far better advertising buys, even though the shows get slightly lower ratings than the Monday flagship shows, except for the first hour on Nitro, because a huge percentage of the Monday night audience for both products is flipping channels when the commercials come on. The story noted the WWF's new direction, and kind of mocked Bischoff's pat response quote to it: "Their idea of competition is what every pimp on every street corner knows. Sex sells, especially to kids. Sooner or later the people in the media and advertising are going to realize what a WWF is doing, and I'm afraid we'll all get lumped in the same bucket of shit." Shaheen noted that Bischoff's statement comes from the moral authority of someone whose biggest female star has posted for Playboy, whom I'm presuming to mean Kimberly of the Nitro Girls. McMahon countered that people are grousing because Turner's group is now playing catch-up, and their best idea of the past year, Goldberg, is a stone-cold ripoff. Austin echoed that remark, saying, "If Goldberg's not trying to copy me, I'd hate to see what would happen if he did." Others feel that saying Goldberg is an Austin knockoff, although both have shaved heads and black trunks with no frills and fairly impressive physiques, their ring styles and personas couldn't be more different. Goldberg is more a copy of the 1985 version of Nikita Koloff, but with more athletic ability and world's bigger push. The story noted Goldberg's media romance with his Jewish ethnicity, coming at a time when the prevalence of Jewish stars in WCW isn't exactly a novelty. Raven and Dean Malenko come immediately to mind, and undercard wrestler Barry Horowitz has gone so far as to wear a Star of David on his trunks. It noted at the end the hot spell may be slowing down, noting that both groups' merchandising has fallen across the board, and bringing up the WWF's being booted out of Scranton, Pennsylvania as a potential first sign. Someone has noted the clash between content and audience in the WWF's product, although ended by McMahon noting that he would change his product tomorrow if that's where the money led. Marcel Gautier, better known worldwide as Skylo Low, one of the original and without question the most famous midget pro wrestler who ever lived, passed away quietly from what was reported as a lengthy illness at his home in Point Calumet, Quebec on November 6 at the age of 70. He was cremated the next day. Sky, who toured the country for 34 years as part of a troupe of midgets that would go from circuit to circuit doing 2 of 3 fall undercard comedy performances, was the most famous with his trademark bald head and classic ring name. Known by some as the unofficial father of midget wrestling, he started out in 1948 when pro wrestling was on network television with Little Beaver, who goes so far back that for the first 3 decades of his career nobody even considered his name as the comedy name it looks to be today. Tiny Roe, Fuzzy Cupid and Tom Thumb as the first generation of American midget wrestlers. Sky, like Beaver, were actual midgets, as opposed to the dwarfs that most of the later midget wrestlers were. He began wrestling shortly after serving in World War II and remained active through 1982, as the unofficial top midget wrestling star in the country, with he and Beaver outlasting the rest of the original group. He was a regular in all the major Northeast arenas, including several appearances per year in Madison Square Garden starting in early 1957, shortly after the New York State Athletic Commission relinquished its ban on midget wrestling, doing largely the same bite the referee's butt routine where midget wrestlers played the role of little children in matches that often lasted 20 to 30 minutes. The midgets as children role is an idea that can be traced back to the inception of the genre. That style of midget wrestler has largely vanished from the pro wrestling culture in this country, aside from a few of the remnants of the 70s Lord Littlebrook troupe like Little Tokyo, who occasionally works Midwest Indies, and Cowboy Lang, who up until recent years would show up in California. However, that mindset has remained prevalent throughout the business and largely spelled the doom of the recent small attempt at reviving the genre by the WWF in the United States under the term minis, using the Mexican stars created by Antonio Pena. Pena, as booker for EMLL and even more so as president of AAA, had largely reinvented the dead genre in 1989, creating incredibly acrobatic minis dressed up as smaller versions of his major stars. Gautier, who was born July 21, 1928, looked old and had the bald head for as far back as anyone could remember, making most think he was far older than he really was. He had been working in a seminary, the same job he had before somehow falling into pro wrestling in the 40s while living in Europe. He had lived near an Indian reservation in Quebec since retiring from wrestling in 1982 with his 91-year-old mother. He was virtually always a heel, and his team was usually put over because he was the name performer, with Tiny Roe his regular tag team partner in the 50s, Fuzzy Cupid in the 60s and Little Brutus in the 70s. He had largely disappeared from the wrestling scene after his retirement, with his final appearance at Madison Square Garden being on November 22, 1982, teaming with Sonny Boy Cassidy to lose to Little Beaver and Sonny Boy Hayes on the undercard of a Bob Backlund vs. Superstar Graham Sellout House. He had no connection to the business until magazine writer Donnie Label suggested inviting him to a recent Fabulous Moolah Liwa convention in the Northeast a few months back. Mad Dog Vachon rerouted his trip to Omaha to fly into Montreal and drive south so Sky could attend, which Sky quietly proclaimed as his fondest memory of his years in wrestling, because 16 years after retiring, he realized that some people, most notably his contemporaries from the 60s and 70s, still remembered him. Raw obliterated Nitro by the biggest margin ever in the November 9th ratings race, but the big surprise is that with the most mainstream publicity of any week in history, the audience for Monday Night Wrestling was below normal standards, entirely due to the WCW decline. The total audience viewing saw Raw with 5,312,000 viewers, as compared to Nitro over 3 hours averaging 4,090,000 viewers and 3,750,000 viewers over the 2 hours and 5 minutes head-to-head. The 9,402,000 viewers watching head-to-head represents a surprising 7% drop in the total wrestling audience average of the previous 4 weeks, which wouldn't be that big of a deal since there is always some fluctuation, except that it came in a week which, based on all the pub everywhere, by all rights should have come close or set all-time audience records, and certainly not resulted in an overall audience drop. But there is nothing negative to say about Raw's production, as the show did a 5.03 rating, 4.91 first hour, 5.17 seconds hour, and 7.5 share, among its best numbers in a competitive situation. Nitro did a 4.06 overall rating, 4.79 first hour, 3.58 seconds hour, 3.82 third hour, and a 6.0 share. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 5 minutes, Nitro did a 3.70 rating, which means the margin of victory head-to-head in ratings points was 1.33, which may be the largest ever for Raw, and certainly would be dating back to late 1995. What's significant about this one is that WCW's poor performance, at least poor when it comes to the competition, came with Hulk Hogan on the show, killing the stigma from last week that the absence of Hogan was the reason they got waxed. In addition, WCW was live and from New York, and more important, WCW went into the show with a lot of mainstream news publicity about the Hogan presidency gimmick, which should have, but didn't help their ratings, and over the course of the 3 hours may have even hurt. With all the rules of thumb about celebrities and mainstream media coverage, for whatever reason, WCW spent a summer with celebrities and a fall with more mainstream coverage than ever, and the result has been a decline in buy rates and TV ratings, which makes no sense. Raw won all 8 quarters. The only one which was close was the first with the Hogan announcement, which may have been more based on the curiosity of how they were going to get out of their announcement throughout the first hour that President Bill Clinton was going to be there live. This went against a less than stellar Raw open with Undertaker vs. X-Pac and Val Venus vs. Steve Blackman, and Raw still won 4.3 to 4.1 a quarter, which by all rights it should have been blitzed in. In comparing the main events, Raw anchored with Rock's career versus his place in Survivor Series against Mark Henry, which did a 5.05 final quarter and 5.53 overrun, while Nitro's Kevin Nash and Lex Luger vs. The Giant and Scott Hall match drew a 4.03 final quarter and a 3.67 overrun. The explanation for this ratings turnaround doesn't exactly take a mathematical genius to figure out. One show has been, and on this night was, consistently and significantly better than the other. For the head-to-head period, the breakdown saw Nitro with 234,000 male 18 to 24, 1,413,000 male 25 to 54, 404,000 male 55 plus, 130,000 female 18 to 24, 489,000 female 25 to 54, 226,000 female 55 plus, 395,000 kids 2 to 11 and 459,000 teenagers. Raw's numbers were 410,000 male 18 to 24, 1,654,000 male 25 to 54, 473,000 male 55 plus, 175,000 women 18 to 24, 735,000 women 25 to 54, 198,000 women 55 plus, 520,000 kids and 1,147,000 teenagers. So Raw won handily in every demographic group, something which is also unprecedented as now Nitro isn't even maintaining its older audience. Japanese television rundown. October 4th Pancrase. 1. Kusei Kubota beat Satoshi Hasegawa via decision after the 10 minutes time limit expired. Mainly grappling with neither getting the other in trouble. Kubota was in control at the end and deserved the decision in an upset. 2. Ikuiza Minowa drew Travis Fulton after 10 minutes regulation and a 3 minutes overtime. Neither had the other in trouble. It was ruled a draw after regulation, sending it into the overtime, and neither man had any advantage there either. All three judges ruled it a draw. 3. Asami Shibuya beat Katsumi Inagaki via decision after 10 minutes. This was good for Pancrase style. Two guys really going for it but under control. It's so hard to beat these experienced guys clean nowadays because they see all the submissions coming. Shibuya dominated and won the unanimous decision. 4. Yuki Kondo beat Daisuke Ishii in a strange match in 2:38. Kondo connected with a left-right combination in literally 2.1 seconds and Ishii went down. The ref stopped the match at 5.4 seconds, which literally stunned everyone. The fans started booing and it was a way premature stoppage. The sub-referee went into the ring and ruled it a slip rather than a knockdown and ordered the match to continue. They restarted it and it turned into the best match on the show as they were trading slaps with Kondo connecting with a knee and nailing him with palms, bloodying him up. Finally Kondo got the leg and was bending it in every direction he could looking for a submission before the ref stopped it when an ankle lock looked particularly sick. 5. Jason Godzi beat Kengo Watanabe in 1:28. It's just too bad. When Watanabe came out, fans reacted to him like he was a superstar and it's evident he's the most charismatic Japanese wrestler this group has ever had besides Funaki. Godzi was just too big and strong for him as he took him down and mounted him, and was literally destroying him with palms with a sick amount of blood flying everywhere like his nose exploded. The fans were going nuts hoping for the comeback but Watanabe couldn't shake him. Eventually he turned his head to avoid the blows, and was choked out. It was heated and real good while it lasted. October 23rd rings. This was the first round of the Battle Dimension tournament, and as I feared, this team deal and new point system for tournament matches is a total flop. It was a really bad show, every bit as bad as the worst US pay-per-view events. Fans don't care about the tournament at all and the matches weren't good. Usually in rings the worked matches are better than the shoots, but this was an all-work show and there wasn't one good match. 1. Masayuki Naruse beat Yasuhito Namakawa in 4:50 with a shoulder lock. It was Namakawa's first worked match since Naruse was Namakawa's teacher. Naruse in the post-match interview said that Namakawa was the brightest new hope in the entire pro wrestling industry. Okay for what it was. 1 star. 2. Holland, Hans Niemann, Dick Frey and Joop Kasteel beat Russia A, Sergei Susurov, Ilyakine Mikhail and Folk Han, in something of an upset. The rules were you could get one knockdown or one submission but on the second one, you were out. It made for a lot of weak finishes. Niemann beat Susurov with a knee to the solar plexus in 2:59. Bad. Mikhail beat Niemann with an ankle lock in 2:54. Mikhail did a few cool moves on the ground but it was too short to build anything. Frey beat Mikhail in 2:50 with a knee to the chin. Real bad. Han beat Frey with an ankle lock in 2:01. Han got nailed with a really stiff kick to the face and wasn't feeling too good. Kasteel beat Han in 2:21. Han kept going down from leg kicks that were ruled as slips and finally went down for a match-ending second knockdown on a kick to the stomach that missed. Just awful. After the match, Kasteel said that it was time for Han to retire. Han is 37 and it's been noticeable all year that he's on the decline but it was never more noticeable than this match. 3. Kiyoshi Tamura beat Vladimir Klementiev in 7:51. This was not one of Tamura's stellar performances. Klementiev is really bad at this, for one. He's like 6'4.5" and 257 so he made Tamura look like a midget at 5'9.5" and 193. Actually Tamura usually works good because he plays the underdog so well, in this situation, but since nobody believed for a second Klementiev had a chance, it was this giant clumsy jobber against a star who was selling to try and put him over and it wasn't working. Klementiev got 2 knockdowns early, while Tamura got a few submissions. Highlight was Tamura getting him in an armbar and Klementiev made a nice escape the first time, but when he was back in the move a second time, the ref stopped it. 1 star. 4. Japan A, Wataru Sakata, Yoshihisa Yamamoto and Hiromitsu Kanehara beat Bulgaria, Todor Todorov, Boris Gilyaskov and Dimitar Petkov. Sakata got a choke in the middle on Todorov in 5:14 in a so-so match, but Sakata's low back went out during the match and he couldn't continue either. Yamamoto beat Gilyaskov in 6:01 in a decent match with a bad-looking finish. Basically Giliaskov ran right into a palm blow, kind of a Jushin Liger looking finish, but he sold it goofy and it really looked bad on the replay. Petkov, who was 6'3", 334, and looked like a monster next to Yamamoto, overpowered him, hit a belly-to-belly, real rare to see suplexes in rings nowadays, and got a necklock submission in 332. This left a tired giant against 206-pound Kanehara. As a story it was good since Kanehara looked like a well-conditioned mini against a Gulliver-like monster who was blown up. The drama was there in the story, but the fans weren't all that into it and Petkov wound up tapping to an armbar in the middle in 4:58. October 24th, New Japan. 1. Jushin Liger beat Kaz Hayashi in 21-12 to retain the IWGP Junior title. The last 10 minutes aired. Hayashi had both Ultimo Dragon and Dragon Kid in his corner. Hayashi worked real hard, but in his biggest match of his career he appeared to be nervous and he was off on spots he usually isn't. Match didn't have much heat until the end. Hayashi did a Frankensteiner and wound up dropping Liger on his head. He came off the top rope, but Liger caught him in a power bomb. With both men on the top, Hayashi jumped off with a move that would be a super jawbreaker. Hayashi did a tope, a running flip off the apron, and a corkscrew tope along with a 450 splash for a near fall. He got another near fall with a dragon suplex. Hayashi went for a springboard where he was supposed to get caught with Liger's palm blow, however they totally missed the spot. Liger hit a palm for a near fall, a super fisherman buster for another near fall before getting the pin with another palm blow. 3.5 stars. 2. Genichiro Tenryu and Shiro Koshinaka retained the IWGP Tag titles, beating Bryan Adams and NWO Sting in 1309. This was bad and had no heat. They were missing spots all over the place. Tenryu ended up pinning Sting with a lariat. Dud. 3. Shinya Hashimoto pinned Keiji Muto in 2037 to become top contender for the IWGP title. The final 14 minutes aired. Hashimoto looked fatter than ever, almost on the verge of being a young Abdullah the Butcher. Actually, I think at the same age Abdullah wasn't even this fat. Not much heat here either. Muto mainly worked over Hashimoto's knees with dragon screws and figure fours, usually ending with Hashimoto making the ropes. A little bit of sloppiness, but Hashimoto was also really stiff with his chops and kicks. Muto hit a Frankensteiner and immediately grabbed an armbar, which is the spot that got the most heat until the rope break. Hashimoto tried one brainbuster, but his injured knee gave out. He then regrouped, tried the move again and got the pin. 2 3/4 stars. October 31st, New Japan. 1. Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Big Titan beat Junji Hirata and Mike Enos in 9:23. With a black mat and a new production look, this NWO Typhoon tour looked more like 70s wrestling transported to the present. Anyway, this match was decent as Enos is an underrated worker and Tenzan is good, although Titan is pretty bad. 1 1/4 stars. 2. Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto and Tatsuhito Takaiwa beat Liger and El Samurai and Kendo Kashin in 14:19. This was a step above their usual standard excellent match. Everyone was on the mark and seemed to turn it up. Kashin in particular probably looked better than he ever has in the past, including a really cool-looking ultra-tight leg rolling cradle. All sorts of near falls and saves, ending with Otani pinning Samurai after a spinning powerbomb, similar to Just Incredible's finisher except it's a powerbomb instead of a tombstone piledriver. 4 1/4 stars. 3. Yuji Nagata and Kazuo Yamazaki beat Kazuyuki Fujita and Manabu Nakanishi in 13:30. This match had a shooter theme since Nagata, Fujita and Nakanishi were all national champion amateur wrestlers and Yamazaki has the UWFI background. They did both UFC and New Japan spots along with some UWFI style work as well. Nagata was really good and carried the match for everyone. He had a great exchange of kicks and chops with Nakanishi. Finish saw Nagata pin Fujita after a bridging back suplex. 3 stars. 4. Muto and NWO Sting and Adams beat Tadao Yasuda and Hashimoto in Kensuke Sasaki in 11:41. This was like 2 matches in one. It was real good when Muto was in and horrible when Adams was in. Adams can't sell it all even when he wants to, and that isn't often. He did hit one nice dropkick which freaked everyone out because he didn't blow the spot. Really, it was Muto's one-man show. Adams ended up pinning Yasuda after a power slam. 2 stars. November 1st, All Japan. 1. Mitsuharu Masao won the Triple Crown from Kenta Kobashi in 43:22. This was probably the best All Japan match of the year. As mentioned last week, Supposedly the match will come off much better when the video is released and the match airs in context. Even in this context, it was the best All Japan bout of the year and as dramatic as any match this year except Tamura vs. Tsuyoshi Kosaka. When the match was over live, it was almost unanimous among the reporters that attend all the shows that it was the best match in Japan this year since it went 43 minutes and was action from start to finish. The TV picked the match up, airing about 1 minute at the 15 minutes mark, and then picked things up again at the 25 minutes call and stayed to the finish. It was slow-paced since they went so long and were selling exhaustion the entire period, which worked since both were dripping in sweat, well executed with lots of cross-ups on the regular spots. It's probably the kind of match that you have to be into the story knowing the spots how they usually look to fully grasp, but since the live crowd fits that bill, they were going nuts. Every move that aired was executed as if it could be a finishing move and they went through nearly everything in their repertoire. The big spot at 15 minutes was Misawa going for an elbow off the apron but Kobashi caught him on the floor with a dropkick. In the ring, Kobashi hit 2 back suplexes and went for a high power bomb, which Misawa attempted to turn into a Hurricane Rana, but Kobashi blocked that into a move similar to a Boston Crab, but Misawa made the ropes. At the 25 minutes mark when it picked up, Misawa hit the elbow suicida, a tope ending with an elbow smash, and an elbow off the top. He delivered a German suplex on his head, and when Kobashi made the surprise rush toward him with a lariat, Misawa beat him to the punch with the elbow. He got near falls with a tiger driver and frog splash. Misawa came off the top but was met with a flying clothesline, the finish of a famous Misawa loss to Taue a few years back, but he kicked out. Misawa went for a monkey flip but Kobashi reversed it and dropped his face on the turnbuckles and gave him a half Nelson German suplex. He delivered a power bomb into the turnbuckles, a DDT and a dragon suplex but Misawa kicked out. He delivered his lariat and an orange crusher for near falls. Another lariat and a near fall, followed by a DDT leg drop and a leg drop off the top for near falls. Kobashi went for a powerbomb on the apron but Misawa blocked and went for a Hurricane Rana off the apron but it was blocked. It wound up with Misawa delivering a tiger driver off the apron to the floor in the big dangerous spot. Kobashi sold it like he was paralyzed. Misawa got him in the ring and dropped him on his head with the tiger driver 91, but Kobashi hit another desperation lariat. Misawa then started destroying the spent Kobashi with elbows, hit a tiger suplex, a running elbow and the sick-looking reverse elbow right to the jaw for the pin. 5 stars. After the match, they aired on the video wall the teams for the tag team tournament. The team of Yoshihiro Takayama and Takao Omori got a surprising pop. So did Johnny Ace and Bart Gunn. I guess the people are desperate at this point for anything new. Apparently Baba didn't have a clue who Bart Gunn was, although his name did get brought up earlier in the year when Bruce Pritchard and Gerald Briscoe were negotiating for a major WWF involvement in the Tokyo Dome show, when Ace made the deal for him as his partner. He now likes him, not because he's seen him wrestle, but because he has good size. Kobashi and Akiyama got a big pop although Albright and Kimala 2 and Misawa and Ogawa didn't get much of a pop. The place literally went unglued with the announcement of the Stan Hansen and Vader tag team. I knew that would be a huge deal. You can tell that's what will draw if they can draw outside Tokyo on the next tour. The final team announced was Kawada and Taue and that didn't even get a reaction since everyone knew and they had popped so big for Vader. Mexico. Dr. Wagner Jr. and El Satanico captured their group in the November 6th tag team tournament to set up the heel vs. heel finals on November 13th for the vacant CMLL tag titles against Bestia Salvaje and Scorpio Jr. Wagner and Satanico beat La Fiera and Felino in the first round, and beat El Hijo del Santo and Shocker in the finals. Main event on the show had Salomon Grundy and Headhunters beating Mexican heels Pierroth Jr. and Cien Caras and Mascara Año 2000 when Pierroth turned on the Dynamitas causing the Mexican team to lose. Also on November 13th besides the tag title is Mr. Niebla and Negro Casas and El Hijo del Santo vs. Blue Panther and Black Warrior and Fuerza Guerrera and Pierroth Jr. and Gran Marcus Jr. and Mascara Año 2000 vs. Atlantis and Shocker and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. Real interesting to see Pierroth working third from the top. Probably as a form of punishment since he no-showed a few weeks back when put second from heat top because he considers himself a main eventer. The CMLL Controlled Commission has banned PAPSA, formerly AAA, from the Distrito Federal claiming their events are shows, as in meaning circus shows, and not wrestling. The commission has also threatened Radamés Coco's promoter's license for running an unauthorized cage match on his October 24th pay-per-view show. Coco is claiming in the press he has a signed letter of authorization from Fantasma, who heads the commission, which makes this story even stranger. The Lady Apache vs. Tanya Women's Hair vs. Hair match on November 15th at Arena Coliseo is the first women's hair vs. hair match on an EMLL show in 5 years. PAPS's November 15th War Zone Big Show in Zapopan has something resembling a Dusty Rhodes War Games as the main event. The teams are Los Vipers, Cibernetico and Maniaco and AAA Hysteria and AAA Psicosis and AAA Mosco de la Merced, versus Los Vados Locos, Sangre Chicana and Picudo and May Flowers, Enigma and Charlie Manson. It'll be in a cage, with both teams sending in 2 men at the start, have the dreaded coin flip, and each minute 1 new man will be allowed to enter. Once all 10 are in the ring, the door is locked and they all fight with no pinfalls or submissions. Then the door is opened again and Tarantes, the ref, is allowed in the cage for the first time, and at that point the match can end. The match continues until all 5 members of one team escapes the cage. Actor Guicho Dominguez will be at ringside to make sure Tarantes is fair as ref. Also, Octagon and El Alabrije and Pero Aguayo vs. Devastador and Pentagon and Killer, Latin Lover and Pero Aguayo Jr. and Heavy Metal vs. Abismo Negro and Kickboxer and Electroshock. Fujin on the Asesca pay-per-view show was Wrestle Dream Factory's Kamikaze. Cuerno de Chivo used to work as Mini Felinito. Lismark Sr., 49, has changed his mind about his imminent retirement upon word that WCW wrestlers will be allowed to work Arena Mexico, as he wants to form a tag team with his son. After Halcón Negro Jr. lost his mask on October 30th at Arena Mexico, he worked the next day in a tournament in Xochimilco with his mask on, and fans were chanting fraud at him since the result of the previous day's match was widely reported. The WCW vs. EMLL feud is scheduled to start somewhere either November 20th, November 27th or December 4th, depending upon which source one wants to believe. No doubt the real story is nobody has finalized it yet, as the most reliable sources are saying late November or early December. If they are going to wait until December 4th, there's no point in even doing so, because the season ends on December 11th, and they won't be back at Arena Mexico until February, so why start a monster business feud and have to put it on ice for nearly 2 months and restart it? Antifaz del Norte won a mask vs. mask match over La Mascara on October 12th in Nuevo Laredo, revealing him as Jorge Martinez, 22, or Gomez Palacios, Durango. According to the latest word in Mexico, it now looks as if it'll be another 8 months before Villano Cuatro can return after the neck injury suffered in WCW. EMLL is looking at doing a special show to reunite legendary 70s and 80s trios the Death Missionaries, El Signo, El Texano and Negro Navarro, Space Cadets, Danny Boy, Lasser and Robin Hood, and Fantasticos, Kato Kung Lee, Kung Fu and Blackman, for one night only. Ocesa on the October 24th pay-per-view show debuted the Ocesa Girls a la the Nitro Girls, Super J Girls and K1 Girls. CMLL will fill its vacant trios titles with a tournament in early December. Wrestler Oriental married wrestler Wendy on November 7th in Mexico City after a 6-year engagement. In title matches over the past week, Black Warrior retained the NWA Light Heavyweight title, beating Tony Rivera on November 6th in Netzahualcoyote, and Archangel retained the Mexican National Welterweight title, beating El Brazo on November 8th in the same city. Headhunter's final match in Mexico before leaving for All Japan was November 10th. All Japan. Although there haven't been a lot of positive signs of late, the October 31st Mitsuharu Misawa vs. Kenta Kobashi match was a huge success by every standard. Besides being probably the best match of the year in the company and among the best in the world, drawing the biggest wrestling crowd ever to Budokan Hall, it also drew a 5.6 rating and 46 share, peaking with an amazing 7.4 rating, which occurred at about 1:10 a.m. on a Sunday. This was the 3rd week in a row that the ratings topped a 4.5. The decision for Misawa to go over was Shohei Baba's, as although after a genuine behind-the-scenes struggle where there was an implied threat of him leaving that resulted in Misawa becoming booker, Baba is still booking the Triple Crown completely. In fact, now at the house shows, after Baba works his undercard 6-man tag, he actually showers and leaves and lets Misawa run the show, except at Budokan. Misawa had openly told people he didn't even want a challenge for the title until early 1999 and wanted Kobashi to this time be established as a real world champion, beating everyone before setting up their big match, but with the business doing so poorly on the road, Baba wanted the belt on Misawa. For whatever this is worth, as it could change, the plan is for Kobashi and Jun Akiyama to win the tournament, although Stan Hansen is said to be pushing hard for he and Vader to win. As mentioned last week, October 25th TV show did a 4.7 rating. New Japan. With the Tokyo Dome upcoming on January 4th, a press conference is expected to be held this week to announce at least some of the matches. There are a lot of different ideas on where to go with this show. Some want to start the New Japan vs. UFO feud, but others feel it's way too early. Perhaps the problem is that tickets are selling poorly, as in not at all, for UFO's December 30th show at 16,000-seat Osaka Castle Hall, and there were those wanting it cancelled. Antonio Inoki was insisting it go on, and to avoid supporting money-draining shows for a long period of time, they could start the interpromotional feud now, although the longer they wait before starting the feud, the more it will mean at the box office when they do. There is even talk of using Atsushi Onita, although the talk, which made both the TV show and newspapers about Riki Choshu coming out of retirement, saw Choshu say on November 9th that it isn't going to happen. Onita issued a grandstand challenge to both All and New Japan for his own pub without contacting either company ahead of time, which All Japan, through separate statements by both Misawa and Baba, said they weren't interested the next day. New Japan is interested in using him once as a novelty for the Dome show, and Choshu on November 9th suggested Onita go against Hashimoto. New Japan's original plans, to debut Bill Goldberg, looks next to impossible since January 4th is also the day WCW has a Georgia Dome event, so they are going to have a hard time getting any big WCW talent, let alone Goldberg, and the NWO split a la WCW with Keiji Muto versus Masahiro Chono is questionable due to Chono's neck problems. Tokyo Dome tickets are already on sale and are said, without any lineup announced, to be selling slower than the usual pace. Kensuke Sasaki and wife Hisako Uno Sasaki, former women's wrestling superstar Akira Hokuto, had their first child on November 6th, a baby boy named Kensuke Sasaki. The first UFO show from October 24th aired on TBS in Japan on November 6th in a post-midnight time slot. David Finlay and Jerry Flynn were officially announced as the WCW representatives in the November 16th to December 6th tag team tournament, which, as you can imagine, was a major letdown. It was also announced that Scott Norton's opponent on December 4th in Osaka for the IWGP Heavyweight title will be Manabu Nakanishi, and people are openly talking of it as being the single least anticipated IWGP title match in history, since nobody believes Nakanishi has a chance of winning, and as things stand now he doesn't, and on paper it's a weak world title match. The October 30th Norton Shinya Hashimoto finish went exactly as it was booked. They were looking for Hashimoto to get knocked out a fluke outside the ring as an experiment, which apparently didn't work live since everyone expects a pinfall in the main event in New Japan. There was some historical dispute regarding the recent Norton vs. Van Hammer Nitro match. It was reported in Japanese newspapers as being an IWGP title match. Norton came to the ring with the belt, but it was never announced as a title match. New Japan then issued a statement first saying that it wasn't a title match, but 2 days later issued a second statement saying that it was. October 24th TV did a 2.5 rating. Other Japan notes. The Akira Maeda vs. Alexander Karelin match was announced for 2/21 at the Yokohama Arena, which would be the pro wrestling debut for the most decorated and successful amateur. I hate to use that term amateur when his appearance fee is something like $80,000 per tournament wrestler that ever lived. Both Michinoku Pro and Big Japan finished their tag tourneys this past week. Michinoku finished up before 755 fans on November 8th in Sendai, with Masato Yakashiji and Naohiro Hoshikawa pulling an upset, beating Super Delphin and Grand Naniwa in 25-33 when Yakashiji pinned Delphin. After the match, Great Sasuke, who is now working as a dirty heel, getting DQ'd nearly every night while drinking, smoking and using foreign objects, with his tag team with Sasuke the Great, congratulated Yakashiji and Hoshikawa on winning the tournament and offered them both Sasuke t-shirts to join his group. The fans cheered Sasuke as a heel above Super Delphin. In the Big Japan tourney, which ended on November 6th in Sendai, rookies Ikuto Hidaka and Minoru Fujita, who I've seen on tape and he's skinny but is already a good worker, kind of a green version of Yakashiji who is a really underrated worker, won the tourney, beating Tomoaki Honma and Katsumi Yujiro in the finals. Hiromichi Fuyuki and Yukihiro Kanemura and Koji Nakagawa beat Riki Fuji and Hayabusa and Daisuke Ikeda to retain the FMW World Street Fight 6-man belts in the main event on November 6th at Korakuen Hall. It appears that November 20th may actually be Onita's last FMW match, although he will be associated with the company. Onita will be in a handicap match against Yoshinori Sasaki Gasaku and Hideki Hasaka. Pay-per-view in Japan is totally different from the US. The buy rates are tiny as fans have grown up with the idea that they'll see all the great matches for free on television, and it's only the smaller groups on pay-per-view and not All Japan and New Japan big shows. Perfect TV, which now has an addressable universe of 700,000 homes, is only doing buy rates in the 0.03 to 0.04 range at prices ranging from $9 ECW to $13 WCW, and Pancrase, which is about the price for a mixed drink at a lot of Japanese bars, so there is no money in it. The satellite company simply buys the rights from the wrestling company as a loss leader to get wrestling fans to hook up to pay-per-view, and it isn't as if they share in any significant profitable revenue. The reaction to Onita by the FMW wrestlers is similar to the general reaction to Hogan in WCW, as a past his prime star who won't step aside or put the younger guys over, and his main event matches are terrible. The situation is similar, because the problem is the company can't sell house shows to local promoters in many cases without promising Onita to appear on the show, as the local promoters feel Onita's face on the poster will sell tickets because the older promoters who aren't current fans remember the days when Onita really was a huge draw. His liar gimmick is dead and he's not over, but because of his name, when he shoots an angle, like he did last week, he can get a lot of publicity for the company that nobody else can get. Saw some highlights of a Big Japan Hardcore Wrestling as it's known in Japan, and their deathmatch title match with Shadow WX Satoru Shiga, defending against Tomoaki Honma from last week. They had maybe 300 fans, being generous with barbed wire in one corner and a board in the other. At one point WX broke a fluorescent light tube over his own head, which is smart because it kills the gimmick of it, before breaking it then over Honma's head. Honma wrapped his head up with barbed wire and did a diving headbutt off the top rope. WX also used a camel clutch with both barbed wire and a toilet seat, and in doing the move the toilet seat actually broke under the pressure. Finally the climax was WX powerbombing Honma off the balcony of the building, looked to be about an 8-foot drop, onto a table covered with barbed wire. Pancrase had a press conference regarding its December 19th pay-per-view show. Nobuhiko Takada wasn't there, and it's pretty well established he won't be appearing with this group as his asking price is way out of their range and probably has no interest in doing so in the first place. The only Takada Dojo vs. Pancrase match that was announced for the show was rookies Minoru Toyonaga of Takada against Daisuke Ishii. They announced Masakatsu Funaki would have his first Valley Tudo Rules match as the main event. The only match announced for the next Pancrase show on November 29th in Osaka is the main event of Kengo Watanabe vs. Ryushi Yanagisawa. Yumiko Hata pinned Manami Toyota in the finals on November 6th of the two-day singles tournament in Naha, Okinawa. As it turns out, tickets are going very well for the November 23rd Battle at Sumo Hall show. The company is getting a real cult following due to Alexander Otsuka's win over Marco Ruiz, and people are interested in Otsuka against the Road Warriors, in their first match in Japan in years. The complete lineup has Tarzan Boy, WWF's Armando Fernandez, versus Mokjunji Katsumi Yujuda and Takashi Hijikata versus Masaaki Mochizuki and Takashi Okamura, Taka Michinoku and Shoichi Funaki versus Ikuto Hidaka and Minoru Fujita, Victor Kruger and Carl Greco versus Masao Orihara and Takeshi Ono, who worked Michinoku as Sasuke the Great and Masked Tiger the last few months, Minoru Tanaka versus Naohiro Hoshikawa, B-Cup Tournament semifinals and finals with semis being Yuki Ishikawa versus Hiskatsu Oya and Great Sasuke versus Bob Backlund, plus Bam Bam Bigelow versus Daisuke Ikeda and Road Warriors versus Otsuka and Muhammad Yone. The November 29th All Japan Women Anniversary show with Chigusa Nagio vs. Manami Toyo will have Nagio defend her GIA World title, called All World title, which shows the political lengths AJW had to go to get her. On their own anniversary show, they are putting over Nagio's world title in the main event, and not their own belt, and the agreement to get Nagio to do the main event was on the stipulation that she wins the match. Expect 16-year-old second-generation star Ayako Hamada to get an even bigger push next month. Here and there. Bates Entertainment of Los Angeles is working on a movie on the Von Erich family. A correction in the NWA show on October 24th, in the Easy Rider vs. Paul Atlas match, it was for the NWA Canadian Heavyweight title and not Light Heavyweight as reported here. Rider won and will defend the title in both the Winnipeg-based and Vancouver-based NWA Indies. Apparently the Steven Regal vs. Dan Severn main event was booked for 14 minutes, and the guys were given the signal to go home at that point. Why they went more than 30 minutes is something I'm not clear of. Yokozuna worked several indie dates this past week in the New Jersey and Maryland area. He's said to still be gigantic. He's told people that he was never offered the spot to do the run-in in the Hall vs. Nash match, but several in WCW insist it was the case, and Hall was calling him up trying to convince him it was an easy $10 grand. What probably makes the most sense is Yokozuna still has designs on getting back into WWF, and working for WCW wouldn't put him in good stead with WWF, but WWF has said they want him only if he can get down to around the 400-pound range, and figure he's nowhere close to today, Ring Around the Northwest reported this month the death of Steve Kovacs, who wrestled as a headliner in Vancouver in the early 70s at Stephen Little Bear on September 29. Little Bear worked on top for promoter Shandor Kovacs, no relation, and Gene Kiniski from 1970 to 1972, holding the Canadian Tag Team title with Don Leo Jonathan, twice with Dean Higuchi, Dean Ho, Mark Lewin, and finally 4 times with Dutch Savage. He also held the area's top singles belt, the Pacific Coast title, with title wins over Bulldog Bob Brown and Kiniski, with his biggest career match coming on March 6, 1972 when he challenged Dory Funk Jr. for the NWA title in Vancouver. He also held the Pacific Northwest title for 9 days, winning and losing to Apache Bull Ramos in 1972 in Oregon, and the Pacific Northwest tag title for 6 months in 1973 with Savage. He disappeared from the scene for several years before resurfacing in Memphis, and later for Leroy McGurk in Louisiana, where he and Ray Candy held the U.S. Tag Team titles twice in 1978. Frank Rogan, who wrestled as Wildfire Frank Rogan, a Pittsburgh-area independent wrestler who used to work with Ken Lord Zoltan Jugan and WCW ref Brian Hildebrand, passed away this past week at the age of 47. He had been living in Streetsboro, Ohio, working in the home remodeling business after living most of his life in New Castle, Pennsylvania. He wrestled 10 to 15 years ago in indies in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. In regard to the note in last week's issue on the origination of the powerbomb vis-a-vis the Genichiro Tenryu vs. Terry Gordy match in Japan, the actual originator of the move was Luthez, who did a move similar to a powerbomb but where he dropped the guy on his neck and shoulders. In Japanese video games, it is now called the original powerbomb. Thez used the move to pin Rikitozen in a legendary match in Honolulu in the mid-50s. Gordy invented the modern version of the move as actually the finish of a double-team move with his Freebird partners, and brought it to Japan, where it became popularized years before many Americans, a few of whom actually picked it up while on Japan tours, started using it. Tenryu was the first Japanese wrestler to regularly use the move as his finisher. Actually, before Gordy ever used it in Japan, Devil Masami was doing a similar move to today's Liger Bomb. Aaron O'Grady, Dick Grimes, Baldo, Matt Bloom, and Sean Stasiak all debuted in Memphis for TV on November 7. O'Grady on his first night and captured the Young Guns title from Kid Wicket in what was said to be a real good match. Grimes debuted coming from under the ring to destroy Brandon Baxter after he had beaten promoter Randy Hales. Hales is using Grimes, Baldo and Stasiak as his big boss mans, and they destroyed Tony Falk and Bulldog Reigns for not protecting him from prior beatings, a la Bossman destroying Briscoe, Patterson and Slaughter on Raw 5 days earlier. Billy Graham, 55, undergoes his 7th hip replacement surgery on November 24. In a Philadelphia Inquirer article on Jesse Ventura, in bringing up Graham as the wrestler Ventura patterned himself after, called him the late Billy Graham. The only thing we could figure out was that about 20 years ago, Gorilla Monsoon had a wrestling column in a Philadelphia daily. I don't think it was the Inquirer, but it may have been, and he wrote an obituary for Graham claiming, as there were rumors prevalent at the time of, that he died from cancer. In those days, like these days, guys at that level simply didn't just disappear from the business like Graham did about a year after losing the WWF title to Bob Backlund. There was literally no communication in the business in those days as well, so it was a lot easier for inaccurate information to remain unchecked, although today it's far easier than ever for inaccurate information to get out, but not remain unchecked. When Graham called up Monsoon to let him know he was alive, Monsoon was too proud to ever print a retraction. Nashville Network will be doing a documentary on the past of roller derby and future of roller jam to air on December 26 at 5 p.m. to kick off hype for the January series. The new deal that starts on January 15 will have 6 teams competing in something called the World Skating League: New York Enforcers, California Quakes, Florida Sundogs, Nevada High Rollers, Texas Twisters, and Illinois Inferno. Congrats to longtime reader and noted pro football writer and syndicated pro wrestling columnist Alex Merves on the publication of his first book, Wild Ride, An Illustrated History of the Denver Broncos. Merves dedicated the book to about a dozen people, one of which was me. That's something that really means a lot to me since I've known and worked with Merves since he was a teenager writing for his high school newspaper, and you have no idea how much that meant. Former newsletter writer Jeff Mangels, now an indie pro wrestler, goes on his first Japan tour for George Takano's group on December 17. Besides Jesse Ventura, there were at least 2 other pro wrestling-related election stories. Former WCW event coordinator and indie promoter Gary Woronchik, Midwest Territorial Wrestling, a Republican and a longtime Observer reader, was elected to the Michigan House of Representatives representing Dearborn. Former AWA wrestler Johnny Stewart, running as Jon Stewart as the Republican candidate, lost in his bid to garner a seat in the Illinois House of Representatives for a Cook County seat by a pretty wide margin. World Legion Wrestling is in Springfield, Missouri on November 22nd for a TV taping with Mabel and Butch Reed. The show is scheduled to air on American Independent Network on December 4th and America One on January 1st. Bill Ash, of a recent NBC documentary, is the promoter for the group. RF video of P.O. Box 797, Langhorne, Pennsylvania 19047 is selling the unedited Bret Hart movie for $24.95, which comes with a photo album and also has Bam Bam Bigelow and Taz 8-hour, 2-tape career shoot interviews for $35 each. Fred Hornby of 82 Highland Avenue, Port Washington, New York 11050 has just finished a Danny McShane record book which sells for $25 plus $3 postage and handling. McShane is considered by some as the greatest worker of his era and was the greatest junior heavyweight drawing card ever in the United States. Others have a less kind view of him as someone who got over simply because of his willingness to bleed every night. The 260-page book, which has results of more than 4,500 of his matches, goes for $25 plus $3 for postage and handling. Music City Wrestling has November 13th in Nashville, headlined by Carl LeDuc vs. Colorado Kid, November 14th in Nashville with Reno Riggins vs. Wolfie D, and November 14th in Collins, Georgia with Billy Black vs. Recon. MMA. As expected, following the announcement that Mike Tyson would fight on pay-per-view on January 16th, UFC moved its scheduled January 15th pay-per-view show to 1/8, and most likely will be moving the location from Birmingham, Alabama to New Orleans. To the best of our knowledge, the only match officially signed is Boss Rutan vs. Tsuyoshi Kosaka, which is a lot bigger deal in Japan than the US, and the decision is pretty well finalized that Frank Shamrock won't be fighting but will be doing announcing work on the show. Officially, Viewers' Choice Canada has overturned its prior decisions and will begin airing UFC imminently, starting on November 21st when it will air a tape of the October 16th UFC Brazil show. On the cable front, this is UFC's first major breakthrough since the tide began going against it politically. VC Canada will also air a 6-hour taped New Year's Eve UFC special which will be available to Dish owners in the US. VC Canada is attempting to use UFC to make up for lost revenue when the Oscar de la Hoya pay-per-view on November 21st was cancelled due to his injury. Negotiations remain ongoing for a submission rules no striking match between Mario Sperry, the current absolute world champion in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and winner of last year's Abu Dhabi submission tournament in both the heavyweight and absolute divisions, and who recently tapped out Royler Gracie, against Royce Gracie for December 17th in Rio de Janeiro. Supposedly promoters have offered Sperry $20,000 and Gracie $50,000 for the match, which would include both a 1-hour time limit and a Jiu-Jitsu rules point system. Sperry, who years ago wrote challenges to Gracie in martial arts mags but now is claiming to respect him for what he did for Jiu-Jitsu, has agreed to fight Gracie under any rules. Gracie doesn't want either a point system or a time limit, but the promoters feel they need both to avoid the possibility of a passive defensive struggle that lasts forever and are said to be unwilling to compromise on these issues. It would be Royce's first match in any form of competition since his 36 minutes draw with Ken Shamrock in 1995. From a technical standpoint, Royce has only lost one match in competition in his life, and it was via points in Jiu-Jitsu rules, although had there been judges, Shamrock would have won their second fight. Hook Shoot Promotions in Evansville, Indiana drew its biggest crowd ever of 1,100 on November 7th. The Attorney General's office in Indiana ordered them to not have the show, but it went on anyway without any problems, at least up to this point in time. The promotion had run 14 previous shows without any state government interference, but the Attorney General's office said they would have to abide by boxing regulations, which means all opponents must be within 10 pounds of each other except in the heavyweight division, and they wanted chokes banned, the latter of which wasn't adhered to, and in a statement called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu a brutal sport. At the October 28th K1 show, the Alexander Otskar 5-minute time-up draw was considered an exhibition match. However, reports are that the finish of Andy Hug's match where his Japanese foe went down for the Asia Kong Uragan pinning backfist appeared on TV to be a worked finish. ECW. There is nothing official new on the television front. ECW is in at least preliminary discussion regarding some sort of national exposure, and at the very least the plan is to buy late-night TV time on local Fox Sports Net affiliates, in particular MSG Cable in New York. Even without any local TV in New York, there was no drop in New York area buy rates for the pay-per-view and house shows over the weekend in Freeport on Long Island, 1,511, and Queens, 1,000, were both sellouts. The other show of the week was November 7th in Poughkeepsie, New York, which drew a near sellout of about 2,000 fans with 1,890 paid. Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley captured the tag titles back from Masato Tanaka and Balls Mahoney on November 6th in Queens, so it wound up being a 5-day title reign. All 3 matches over the weekend were said to have been considerably better than the pay-per-view match. The situation with Bam Bam Bigelow appears to be that he's gone, although Paul Heyman was saying that it wasn't 100% Bigelow didn't work this weekend for ECW, and instead worked smaller Northeast Indies. Heyman started an angle in Queens where Shane Douglas and Chris Condito invited Taz to join the triple threat, provided he took out Sabu before the 1/10th pay-per-view show. However, Bigelow is going to work the FMW and Battle Arts dates in Japan on November 20th and November 23rd booked through ECW. Heyman said that he figures the odds are that Bigelow is going to WCW but is under the impression it's not 100%. He said he offered Bigelow the rights to promote house shows in New Jersey every Wednesday at high school gyms with a lower budget, only using the local ECW talent to cut back on expenses and cutting way back on the brawling in the stands and blood so as to make it a palatable product for high school gyms, and offered him $1 per head, $2 for every ticket sold over 1,000. Heyman is strongly exploring adding Wednesday night shows, which he wouldn't even run, to give the younger wrestlers more ring time. The ECW CD debuted at number 191 on the Billboard charts with 7,690 sales. WWF Stone Cold CD was at number 170 this past week with 9,070 sales. Jack Victory appears to be out of action for 1 year minimum due to the broken leg suffered on the pay-per-view, which most likely will require several operations. Mike Awesome had his knee operation on November 7th and he figures to be out of action until around August. Johnny Smith and Wolf Hockfield, who also wrestled as Jim Steele, are headed in for a look. Heyman recognized coming out of the pay-per-view that he needs more depth, particularly when doing 6 pay-per-view shows next year, and Smith is colorless, but a really good worker. Jerry Lynn was out of action again this week due to a badly bruised back. Sabu injured his back on November 5th against One Man Gang when Gang didn't catch him on a flying move. He worked the rest of the weekend but was looking real bad. Lance Storm's shoulder was out but he did work during the week and had a good TV match in Queens against Mikey Whipwreck. ECW didn't pass out tapes of the TV show to all the fans at the Queens show as they had promised the previous show they'd do as long as they didn't have New York TV, claiming a problem with the fire marshal, but did take everyone's name and promised to mail them the last 4 weeks' worth of television shows. If anyone had problems ordering the last ECW pay-per-view show due to problems with their local cable company, ECW asks that you fax a letter to Viewer's Choice at 212-980-4080 to explain the basics of what the situation was. WCW. Nitro from the Nassau Coliseum drew a sellout 13,891, paying $419,160 for a show that sold out in 3 hours. It opened with a parking lot brawl with Nash and Connon versus Hall and Giant. They then pushed hard that President Clinton would be there live. Juventud Guerrera pinned Kaz Hayashi in 12:31 with a roll-up after Sonny Wanu interfered and kicked Hayashi. Tremendous match before the shit finish. Alex Wright versus Barry Horowitz went 3:32 with no finish as the Wolfpack just showed up, right left, and Nash patted Horowitz on the back. Eric Bischoff came out and they issued challenges back and forth for the TV double main event. Scott Norton destroyed Lodi in 17 seconds with a power bomb. Disciple did an interview. Stevie Ray Vincent and Horace Hogan came out to confront him. As you can imagine, this segment was dying. Then they attacked Disciple and of course Warrior made the save. There was an initial pop for Warrior, but even without him speaking to me, Warriors, he was already getting booed after a few seconds in front of his Warriors. With a zillion local actors, if you look close, you'll notice one of them is Tom Luscious Johnny Valiant Sullivan, who is now doing local acting and was trying to get into WCW, acting as Secret Service men and teasing Clinton. Hogan and Bischoff came out of the limo with Hogan dressed exactly like Ventura. Hogan said he was running for president and kissing Ventura's ass well past the point of nausea. Hogan is setting a record time from being the biggest money player in the game to becoming a pathetic old man right before our eyes. Actually, this was a smart idea on the surface, because it got more mainstream pub than you'd ever believe, but what did it matter when the end result was turning off so many viewers? He was supposed to announce his running mate, but he didn't. There were hints all day in media that he was going to announce either Ross Perot, Oprah Winfrey, or Ted Turner, emphasizing Turner, figuring they could get him to do it, but Ted wisely wouldn't be a party to this angle, and he had nobody to announce. He's not got 7 more days to find a celebrity dumb enough to let their name go up in flames in a bad angle. I wonder if Hogan is the first candidate for president, and they're going to file and push this forever. Who was ever given government immunity against prosecution to testify in a federal trial? Rey Mysterio Jr. pinned Eddie Guerrero in 12:39 with an Oklahoma side roll. Almost the entire match was Guerrero working on Rey's knee. Chavo came out and Rey knocked Eddie into Chavo before the pin. Nowhere close to what you'd expect from these two. Eric and Liz did an interview. If you thought the Hogan segment was bad, this was like all-time bad, ranking up there with that segment when Roddy Piper fought his buddies for 18 minutes. They hired 3 pro stuntmen to act as nerdy execs for Eric to bully. Fans got sick of this in a hurry. Eric told everyone that Flair wasn't going to appear, more on that later, and ended up punching one and kicked the other two. The blows looked horrible and their selling of those blows was like all-time worst in history. Scott Steiner and Marcus Bagwell came out. Mickey J left the ring saying it was an unsafe working environment and none of the refs would officiate a Scott Steiner match. Scott challenged anyone in the dressing room. You can imagine the pop when Chris Adams came out to get obliterated. Rick Steiner came out and said he'd give Scott and Buff a tag title shot. Do you realize that by far the hardest working athletes on Nitro are the Nitro girls? Rick came out to defend the tag titles, and I guess poor Kenny Chaos has been replaced as Rick's partner by Judge Judy Bagwell. Buff tried to punch his mom, she ducked and slapped him. Scott and Buff then ran away. Then Rick challenged them to another title match on the pay-per-view. They accepted. Then they left. Let's see, they've got a shot right there live for the tag title against a 55-year-old woman who went into the ring in street clothes and wearing earrings, and they walked out. But then, against the same opponents, they jump at the chance for a match on pay-per-view. Judy then cut this terrible promo. Judy got over really big in her first TV appearance and hasn't since. It's one thing if you do a gimmick that's dumb but the people buy it or are entertained. But this crap isn't over. Anyway, they're going to do a tag title match on the pay-per-view on November 22nd with Rick and Judy defending the belts, being that the only one of the 4 who is actually healthy enough to wrestle is Judge Judy. It has all the makings of a classic show between that match and the Battle Royal. Conan beat Bret Hart via DQ in 7:07 when Hart destroyed Conan's knee with a chair. Hart's post-match destructions are great. Chris Jericho did an interview running down Bill Goldberg. They showed Goldberg arriving at the building and watching Jericho run him down on his dressing room monitor. Instead of going out there, he wasted valuable time wasting all the furniture backstage. Finally he came out and wasted Jericho with a sick tackle on the floor. The original plan was for these two to wrestle in a singles match on the show. The problem with their feud is that as entertaining as Jericho is, Goldberg for some reason doesn't want to work with him because he considers him a cruiserweight and also doesn't like how Jericho is working the feud. Finally Nash and Luger beat Hall and Giant via DQ in 9/11 when Hart came in and attacked Nash. Typical dud match with a predictable run-in finish. They got away with it every Monday in 1997, but the ratings are telling them it's time to change the pattern. After that was over, they taped another hour that aired the next day on TNT. Mysterio Jr. beat Dandy via DQ when LWO interfered and Kidman made the save, but in trying to save Mysterio Jr., he gave him a missile dropkick. Saturn beat Sick Boy in 3:41 with the rings. Booker T beat Disco in 5:11 with a sidewalk slam. T tried a folding press and it wouldn't fold, so it looked hilarious. It was so bad the announcers were joking about it and T was even laughing about his miscue. Steve McMichael beat David Finlay with a tombstone in 4:15. Have you ever noticed when McMichael sells, he looks like he's a guy who is completely wasted and glassy-eyed and nobody is home upstairs. Finally Goldberg beat Meng to keep the title in 2:01. The only interviews were replays from the previous night. The crowd was dead since this show was taped from 11:20 p.m. to past midnight, so they piped in crowd noise in post-production, and did it so amateurishly that crowd noise has never sounded so fake. It doesn't look like Ric Flair is going to be doing the Kansas City, Nassau Coliseum and Philadelphia house shows against Goldberg after all. Flair nixed the deal saying that since his Starrcade match against Bischoff is supposed to be if he loses, he retires, and his first match back, and if that's the case, he can't work KC since it's before Starrcade, and he can't work Nassau and Philly or at least be advertised in the main event because it wouldn't make sense since he has a retirement match beforehand. Since when does making sense have anything to do them advertising and booking of pro wrestling? Flair and the Horsemen were all at Nassau and were scheduled to shoot a major angle with Bischoff. As you can see, it didn't happen and they weren't even used on the show. The only conclusion I can come up with about that entire Nitro show is that there was so much media backstage. Extra, hard copy, Maxim, Forbes, Cigar Aficionado, Time, People, Playboy and Pro Football Weekly, that Hogan and Eric were playing more for personal mainstream press and less for the live audience and ratings. Hart appeared on TSN's Off the Record on November 6 to plug the movie, which had its Canadian grand opening this past week. Believe it or not, WWF made an effort recently to buy the rights to distribute the movie. Actually, it makes sense if you think about it. Mysterio Jr. vs. Guerrero was supposed to take place on Nitro on November 2nd, with Mysterio Jr. winning to set up getting his shot at Kidman's title on the pay-per-view. The match didn't take place because Guerrero was warming up by jumping up and down, and in jumping, cracked the top of his head open against a pipe and couldn't work. The match wound up taking place on the second taping of the November 5th Thunder for a November 12th air date. The reason they did the angle where Nick Patrick was destroyed by Scott Steiner is because his knee went out and needs surgery from a mistimed ref bump in the Hogan Warrior match. Telemundo officially has told WCW it's no longer interested in a Latino show for the reasons we've mentioned for months, as far as not wanting the stars on its shows to be jobbers on American TV, and also because it's a rival of Galavision, and with the WCW Mexican wrestlers going to Arena Mexico, they'll be appearing on Galavision in the States, and Telemundo doesn't want to have the same wrestlers on its TV as on Galavision. Wrath taped an episode of Mortal Kombat, the series, and is testing for a movie called Gladiators. Thunder on November 5th in Roanoke, Virginia drew a sellout 8,470, 7,750, paying $151,980. It also did a 3.58 rating and 5.48 share on the live show, and a 1.0 rating and 3.7 share on the replay. Canyon beat Horowitz in 4:03 with a flatliner. Scott Steiner, looking probably more freakish than ever, did an interview that went way too long and got almost no crowd reaction, challenging Luger for the TV main. Wright beat Raven via count out in 3:22. Raven had a nasty-looking bump on the top of his head. Raven just walked off. Booker T beat Fit Finlay in 4:13 with a roll-up in an okay match. Ernest Miller came out. Hayashi ran out and the cameras panned to Glacier coming in. Glacier got in the ring while we finally got to see Pork-Kaz asleep on the mat. They squared off, and finally Glacier told Miller he didn't him to watch his back because he and Glacier couldn't get a break there because they both came from a karate background. Maybe they should join Bobby Walker and Vince McMahon and file a lawsuit. Miller didn't seem to care. Maybe NBC should do another special on wrestling and delve into something more complicated, like explaining WCW booking. Horace pinned Norman Smiley in 140 with a suplex. Eddie Guerrero drew Mysterio Jr. over 9:08 with one of those bell ringing with no build-up you can hear everyone groan draws. The stips were if Ray lost, he'd have to join the LWO. The announcers never once built up this was taking place or a stip match would take place later in the show, so when they sprung it on everyone, it just proceeded to show everyone how unimportant these guys are. Mainly Eddie worked on Ray's knee. Only an average match, but better than their Nitro match. The LWO went to attack Ray after, but Eddie stopped them. Jericho beat Prince Iaukea with a loin tamer in 5:25. Hull beat Disco in 2:28 with the Edge. The Horseman came out to a great pop, and this was the highlight of the show. Michael wasn't there as his leg had some sort of an infection and they had to drain blood out of it, although he did work a few days later. Anderson did a great interview and Flair was on as well, with his best line being that someday he's going to tell Hogan what he has to do. Steiner destroyed Patrick, who did a stretcher job. Luger and Scott wrestled with no ref, winding up with Luger racking Scott and Mickey J. Rannon, but Bagwell attacked both Luger and Jay. Also on the show, the opener saw Chip Minton get a tryout and beat Chris Farrell of the Power Plant. For the November 12th show, Mysterio Jr. and Juventud went about 15 minutes to a draw, and had a sudden death with Ray winning with a Frankensteiner off the top about 3 minutes later. Said to be good but not great. Glacier beat Chris Adams. Wanu and Miller came out and Miller kicked Adams in the head. Glacier is now using the old Terry Gordy dreaded Asiatic spike as his finisher. If you don't know the story, Gordy about 15 years ago was in Japan, and he went on top of this big mountain and met some guy who must have looked like David Carradine's grandfather or at least Elio Gracie and was calling him Grasshopper for some reason. Anyway, Gordy got this ancient sensei master totally wasted on sake, and the guy taught him this secret hold that in some war 400 years ago was a secret military maneuver so deadly that nobody was allowed to reveal its secret. Like all the people in the world wanted to know this secret move, and Terry Gordy was the one smooth enough to develop a plan to steal the Mono Y Mono H-bomb maneuver. And see, this guy was in that war since he was 500 years old. And, well, you get the picture. Actually, it sounded so much more entertaining when Michael Hayes explained it. Did you know that people actually bought that 15 years ago? Well, maybe they didn't. But the promoters actually told those stories and believed their audience to be so stupid that they would. Kidman kept his title beating Chavo via DQ. LWO attacked Chavo and Ray made the save. In the brawl, Ray accidentally nailed Kidman with a missile dropkick. Stevie Ray pinned Jerry Flynn. Chaos beat Kendall Windham. For whatever reason, Bret Hart no-showed and he was supposed to wrestle Malenko. It wound up with Kanyon taking his place and Kanyon was DQ'd when Raven interfered. Giant beat Conan via DQ in that show's main event when Conan hit him with a chair. Said to be better than you'd think. Add Page vs. Hart for US title to the pay-per-view show. Benoit is about 3 weeks away from returning from his elbow problems. Rick Steiner's shoulder was re-injured. The Battle Royal appears to be down to Nash, Luger, if he agrees to turn, or Hogan. For WCW to take the belt off Goldberg right now would be nuts, since, whether he can work or not, he as champion is doing big business and nobody else is going to be able to draw as well on top, and that's sort of what this is supposed to be about. He's also the only wrestler in the company capable of competing with Austin for mainstream pub. He first needs to get in a serious program and run with an opponent for a few months and show his first serious vulnerability or angle where he gets laid out and looks for real revenge, and then come back from it. They've got all that before even worrying about a second program where you could consider having the belt stolen from him for a short-term grudge deal. Tully Blanchard hasn't signed and is telling people he isn't going to WCW. People who have seen him on indies report that for old-style wrestling, he's very good, but with his look right now, he's not going to make it in a big company. Pay-per-view dates for next year are January 17th sold out in Charleston, West Virginia, 2/21 Super Brawl in Oakland, 3/14 Uncensored in Worcester, Massachusetts, April 11th Spring Stampede, May 9th Slamboree, June 13th Great American Bash, July 11th Bash at the Beach, August 7th Road Wild, Nuff Said, September 12th Fall Brawl, October 24th Havoc, November 21st World War III and December 19th Starrcade. It's being reported in Australia that a local rock promoter will be doing a WCW tour in May, including a pay-per-view. From what we understand from WCW, there are negotiations but no deal is done. The idea from the WCW side is they might send some wrestlers on a tour to Australia during the NBA playoffs since Nitro gets bounced around so nobody cares about the ratings that month. But who knows if there even will be NBA playoffs. Race, a horse that is owned 15% by WCW promoter Zane Bresloff, won the $1 million Breeders' Cup Sprint on November 7th. Waterboy was the top-rated movie last week. Giant was in about 1 minute total, most of which aired on the TV trailers. Some talk Sting won't be back now until February. It's no coincidence Hall's performance on TV has improved over the last 2 weeks. He's also dropping the TV survey speech. Public Enemy and Ultimo Dragon have been dropped from the roster. He has contacted ECW about returning, and it wouldn't be surprising if they went back for the short run against the Dudleys, but long run is questionable. Dragon is on disability insurance and it is said that he makes out better that way, and if he can return, they won't hesitate to re-sign him. I was a big fan of the Nitro Girls as diversionary entertainment between matches on TV, but they are being overused. November 3rd WCW Saturday night tapings in Fort Myers, Florida drew 2,684 paying $56,090. Almost nothing of note. Guerrero beat Hayashi in a match that aired on November 7th as did Luger over Giant via DQ. For November 14th, the top matches are Jericho over Disco, Mysterio Jr. over Dandy, Eddie Guerrero over Raven via DQ. House shows this week saw November 4th in Sarasota, Florida drew 2,319 paying $46,768. November 6th in Charleston, West Virginia drew 11,818 paying $210,930. November 7th in Pittsburgh drew a sellout 6,164 paying $110,800, and November 8th in Johnstown, Pennsylvania drew 4,028 paying $80,810. The crowd in Charleston was amazing considering the lineup was a 6-match show with Goldberg vs. Giant, Luger vs. Hall and Meng vs. Norton, which turned into a tag. Same basic show in Pittsburgh also sold out. We don't have figures for Fort Myers, but merchandise for the other 6 shows this past week was $284,425 or $6.19 per head. Correction from last week. On the tape Thunder that aired on October 29th, Scott Hall beat Steve Armstrong and wasn't doing the drunk act. For those who think WCW overpays its wrestlers, the total payroll for the company is $36 million and the company this year will gross between $175 million and $200 million. If you compare that with pro sports, the wrestlers, and that includes Hogan, Hart and everyone except Rodman, are totally underpaid by the standards of baseball and basketball. By the way, in regard to the item of Rodman's pay for the Bash at the Beach pay-per-view from last week's issue, he was paid a $1.5 million base and a 50% cut above $5 million gross, or approximately $2.51 million for the match. He's suing WCW for another $550,000. Some numbers to choke on. For the Bash at the Beach, the company grossed $7 million, but when you take out Hogan, Rodman and Malone's pay, you're left with maybe $2.5 million, or less than most WWF and WCW pay-per-view events this year, although more than what you'd be left with after Road Wild taking out Leno's pay. It isn't that using Rodman was a mistake, but they agreed to semi-retarded terms to get him, and for that kind of money, he no-showed Nitro and was barely there for the pay-per-view. On the sold-out show in January, with Flair vs. Hart on top and no Hogan involvement, the show grossed $4 million without any major bonus payoffs to talent other than their regular salaries. The Miami Herald ran 2 Goldberg stories last week based around the November 2nd Nitro in Fort Lauderdale. One story was about his mother, who lives in Coral Gables, Florida, talking about Bill being a national spokesperson Society of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. A second story was largely about the TV show Nitro, covering how much merchandise is sold at Nitro events, and how most of the Nitro events are sellouts. WCW Saturday Night on November 7th drew a 2.6 rating. WWF. A lot of speculation this past week has revolved around the situation between the WWF and its top star, Steve Austin. At press time, it appears the situation is stable and not all that different from usual. The biggest problem stemmed from Bill Goldberg getting a role in the upcoming Jean-Claude Van Damme movie Universal Soldier 2 that the producers originally wanted Austin in. They went to the WWF, and according to what WWF officials claim and told Austin, offered $55,000 for the role. The WWF turned down the offer as being too low without ever consulting with Austin. The producers went to WCW and signed Goldberg to the role, with some of the filming starting this week. Incidentally, shooting was arranged to not conflict with his movie schedule. Whether the problem stemmed is that Austin's agent, Elliot Pollock, must have brought the movie up and Austin knew nothing about it in the first place and told Austin that Goldberg was getting $250,000 for the role. Austin complained to McMahon, who gave him a $50,000 figure as to what was offered and that it was too low, but eventually McMahon put the heat on Jim Bell, who heads licensing, saying he was the one who fielded the offer and turned it down and blamed him for not consulting with Austin first. McMahon ended up actually sending Austin a company letter of apology for how it was all handled, which pretty well smoothed everything over. Based on what Austin, who is under contract to WWF through 2002, earns in wrestling and what he'd be worth in the movies at the box office right now, a $55,000 figure for a movie would be low, but he's also never done anything of that type, and sometimes you have to go in low to prove yourself in a new field. There were concerns from Austin over learning that New York Magazine wanted him on its cover and McMahon wouldn't allow it and tried to push Rocky Maivia on them, which they wouldn't accept, and that Maivia received a promotional deal from Walmart originally scheduled for Austin. Austin, like most of the top wrestlers in both companies, has input to an extent over his character, has changed certain original plans, such as the plan for him to be left laying on the November 2nd Raw in the cage by Big Boss Man, which instead wound up with both of them battling and winding up with Undertaker and Kane in there. And he nixed a plan, which may have been for Survivor Series, where Shane McMahon was to turn heel ref and screw him on a finish, and it would turn out that the McMahon family had worked together all along. November 9th Raw was taped on November 3rd in Dallas before a sellout of 13,684, paying $274,808 at Reunion Arena. Before the Raw show saw Zane Morris of the Texas All-Star Promotions Generation X crew beating Mercenary in a tryout, and for Shotgun it was DOA over Farouk and Bradshaw, Christian keeping the light heavyweight title over Takumi Chinoku. For Heat, which drew a 4.17 rating and 6.3 share, and the follow-up USA shows didn't benefit at all from the monster rating, as Pac Blue only did a 1.7 and the rest weren't any better. I've figured out the reason for that. Some wrestling fans sampled the show in August for the Tanda commercials and some others when Triple H and Sable were on, but after seeing it a few times, they all realized the show sucks and quit watching. Now apparently with Michael Cole and Jim Cornette as the permanent hosts, it was Al Snow introducing Bob Holly and Scorpio as the Job Squad, and they beat too much. Mr. Sacco is now working as the headband around Mr. Head, although Mankind hasn't figured it out yet. In the finish, the ref held up on the 3 like the Job Squad was supposed to lose, but had count 3 when nobody kicked out. Val Venus explained the reason he knew he wasn't the father of Terry's baby is because he had a vasectomy many years ago. I can see why he's pissed. Imagine the idea of the woman cheating on her husband is also cheating on her boyfriend. What a concept. X-Pac was in the ring to face Steven Regal, but Undertaker came out and choke-slammed him. Godfather beat Mark Merrow with a Death Valley driver, which they called a pimp drop. Shane McMahon riffed, and while the match was going on, Vince was backstage critiquing his work. They showed a Sable training video. Let's just say over the years I've seen a lot of great athletes train, and none trained like that. Droz beat Jeff Jarrett via DQ when Hawk attacked Droz. Animal attacked Hawk and they gave him the Doomsday device and left him laying. The show ended with a confrontation between Vince and Rock. Raw opened with X-Pac versus Undertaker. Taker was stomping him for a few seconds when the lights went out and Kane came down. Kane shot a blowtorch at Undertaker, who shoved X-Pac in the way and he got the fireball in the eye. Venus beat Steve Blackman via DQ when Terry hit Venus down there. It's a wonder he can still do those porn videos with all the damage his lower extremities get in every match. Owen Hart in Blue Blazer, definitely not Phil LaFon, way too small, and not Teddy Hart either, attacked Blackman. A three-way with Jesse Jam, Mosh and D'Lo Brown saw Mosh pin Jam after a stage dive, Thesz press off the top rope, to give the impression that the tag titles could change in the three-way at Survivor Series. Bad. Mankind got a makeover. Hilarious. Goldust wrestled Jarrett. Terry came out dressed as Marlena but Goldust blew her off. Deborah distracted Goldust as he had Jarrett set up for Shattered Dreams, yet another low blow, and since he was distracted, it proved he's heterosexual and therefore all those rednecks that hated him the last time he played face should know they can cheer him. They also allowed Jarrett to hit him with the guitar for the DQ. Goldust attacked Jarrett in the back as they were doing a Rock interview, and then Blazer attacked Goldust. In a match taped at this point but wound up being edited off the show, Regal beat Golga. The match was a total mess, as Regal hit Golga and his mask flew off. Everyone just stood there not knowing what to do. There was an earthquake chant. Golga ran under the ring until someone could get his mask and give it to him. Regal and the oddities were stalling, and at one point Regal threw Mr. Cartman up the ramp. When Golga got his mask on, he came back in and Regal DDTs him on a chair for the pin. Mankind beat Shamrock in a Falls Count Anywhere match for the hardcore title when Bossman, under orders from McMahon, cost Shamrock the match. Austin and Bossman had an argument which was a pretty good confrontation to build their pay-per-view match. Tiger Ali Singh beat Snow. Actually, Snow was wrestling Babu and gave him a snowplow, Northern Lights bomb. Deborah stole the head and was rubbing his, or hers, I haven't quite figured out what sex Mr. Head is, face against her latest boob job, which distracted Snow and allowed Singh to hit a facebuster and pin Snow in 221. Kane beat Edge via DQ in 427. Kane came out with gasoline and a blowtorch. Christian and Gangrel attacked Kane with Edge, but he came back and choke-slammed all three and left them laying. He poured the gasoline on all of them and set up to light them on fire. The ref tried to stop him, but he got choke-slammed. A zillion officials came out. When the fans realized Kane wasn't going to commit first-degree murder before their eyes, they started booing heavily. Those lousy officials ruined all the fun. Kane was so mad he went into the crowd and choke-slammed a plant. You know, a fake fan. Not a piece of shrubbery, although this fan did sort of look like shrubbery. It's funny that even though Kane had just destroyed a fan, not one fan in the crowd believed he wasn't a plant by their reactions, and none had even the slightest bit of fear as he ran rampant in the audience. Vince did an interview and ripped on the Cowboys. Shane came out. Vince told him to leave. Naturally he wouldn't. Vince told Bossman to pound on him. Before Bossman could, Austin made the save. Finally, Rock versus Mark Henry, with Rock winning, getting back in the pay-per-view, and losing, getting fired. This was really well booked. Rock was jumped in the dressing room and they teased for the last hour he couldn't wrestle. McMahon said if he couldn't wrestle, he'd be fired. As if. Finally he came out in sweat clothes and he actually dragged a decent match out of Henry. Rock had him beat, but D'Lo Brown pulled the ref out of the ring. Bossman tried to interfere, but Rock handcuffed him to the corner. With no ref, he gave Henry the rock bottom and people's elbow, and Shane ran in and counted the fall. Even though the finish was totally predictable, the timing of it was great. After the match, Rock pulled Vince out of the wheelchair and gave him the rock bottom and people's elbow. Insane Clown Posse quit. Apparently they were promised a commercial for their CD on Raw, didn't get it, and left. Huge loss. Negro Casas beat Shoichi Funaki on a Super Astros taping match on November 2nd in Houston. This Mexican deal is getting really interesting. Supposedly WWF this past week signed both Casas and Leo Del Santo to contracts for the U.S. Paco Alonso, who heads EMLL, where Casas and Santo are the two biggest draws, had told WCW that they'd work one WWF taping and that would be it. WWF has also signed Apollo Dantes, which is actually good for WCW, although they don't realize it, because Alonso would have pushed for him to get a WCW contract and he doesn't have a prayer of making it. The interesting thing is that all three would likely be wrestling WCW guys at Arena Mexico, and if so, those matches would air in the US on Galavision, and you'd have to think neither WCW nor WWF would want its contracted talent to job for rival group contracted talent on shows that air in the US. And to make things even more interesting, Casas is the EMLL booker, which means he'll have major say-so in a feud involving WCW talent while under contract to WWF, and he'd probably want to put himself right in the middle of the feud, both because bookers do that and also because he should, since he's probably the most over wrestler in that arena. Casas is 38 and is an all-time great worker and has great live charisma, but has kind of coasted for the past several years, so don't know how good he'll do starting up in a new area where he isn't over because of his long-established name and charisma. Santo is 36, and also an excellent worker, but actually lacks charisma, which is rare for someone with 16 years of being a top draw, but that just goes to show how over his father was. He may mean something to Mexican fans, but to fans who didn't grow up with Santo movies, his charisma is going to